The Little Albert experiment, conducted in 1920, is one of psychology's most infamous and ethically troubling studies. Led by John B. Watson, a pioneer of behaviorism, and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, at Johns Hopkins University, the experiment aimed to demonstrate that emotional response, such as fear, could be conditioned in humans. The subject, named Little Albert, whose real identity was later suspected to be Douglas Merritt, was a 9-month-old baby. Initially, Albert showed no fear of a white rat, a rabbit, or other stimuli. Watson and Rayner then paired the presence of the white rat with a loud, frightening noise, made by striking a steel bar with a hammer. After repeated pairings, Albert developed a fear response to the rat alone, illustrating classical conditioning. This fear crossed over to other things, including a rabbit, a dog, and even a fur coat. In the short term, the study demonstrated that humans could be conditioned to fear specific objects. However, the long-term effects on Albert are unclear, as he was removed from the study before Watson and Rayner could attempt to decondition his fear. Some accounts suggest he lived a tragically short life due to unrelated health issues, making it impossible to assess the full psychological impact. This experiment had profound implications for psychology, showcasing the power of conditioning in shaping human behavior. However, it also raised significant ethical concerns. Albert was subjected to distress without proper consent or safeguards, highlighting the need for ethical guidelines and research. Societally, the study contributed to the development of behaviorism, influencing practices in therapy, education, and advertising. However, it also serves as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the importance of prioritizing the welfare of research participants. The Monster Study, conducted in 1939, was a controversial speech experiment led by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist, and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, at the University of Iowa. The study sought to understand the origins of stuttering and whether it was caused by genetic predisposition or learned behavior. It involved 22 orphan children from Davenport, Iowa, some of whom had no prior speech issues. The children were divided into two groups, with one receiving positive reinforcement and being praised for their fluency, whereas the other group was subjected to negative reinforcement, being told their speech was flawed and that they were developing stutters. This negative feedback led to severe psychological effects, particularly in children who had no pre-existing speech problems. Some of these children developed speech issues, anxiety, and social withdrawal as a result of this experiment. Decades later, some participants spoke out about the lasting harm caused by the study, and the Monster Study remained largely hidden for many years due to its unethical nature. When it came to light in the early 2000s, it sparked outrage and criticism of the researchers' disregard for the well-being of the children involved. The University of Iowa eventually issued an apology and settled lawsuits filed by some of the participants. The MKUltra experiments were a series of covert research projects conducted by the CIA between 1953 and the early 1970s. The program aimed to develop methods of mind control, behavior manipulation, and interrogation techniques, particularly during the height of the Cold War. Directed by Sidney Gottlieb and overseen by CIA officials, MKUltra operated under extreme secrecy, often without the consent or knowledge of participants. The experiments involved administering drugs like LSD, as well as subjecting individuals to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and psychological torture. Participants included unsuspecting civilians, military personnel, and prisoners, often chosen without their consent. Many suffered severe psychological and physical harm, and in the short term, victims of MKUltra frequently experienced confusion, paranoia, memory loss, and psychosis. Some developed long-term mental health issues, including depression and PTSD, while others ended their own lives. The program's impact was not limited to individuals, as it eroded public trust in government institutions when it was exposed in the 1970s. MKUltra was officially revealed during congressional hearings, including the Church Committee investigations in 1975. Much of the program's documentation has been destroyed, limiting the full extent of accountability. Nevertheless, its exposure raised awareness about government overreach, unethical experimentation, and the abuse of power. The fallout led to stronger oversight of intelligence agencies and stricter regulations on human research, such as the creation of the Institutional Review Board system. The MKUltra experiments remain one of the most notorious examples of unethical government-sponsored research, being condemned for its disregard of human rights and the profound harm inflicted on its victims. The World War II German experiments, conducted by German doctors and scientists between 1939 and 1945, were among the most inhumane and disturbing events in medical history. These experiments were carried out in concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, under the guise of scientific research. Victims included Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, prisoners of war, and other marginalized groups. The experiments aimed to further German ideology, support the war effort, and test the limits of human endurance. Notable experiments included hypothermia studies, where prisoners were immersed in freezing water to test survival techniques, high-altitude tests under pressure chambers, which often resulted in death or permanent injury, and chemical exposure trials, including the testing of poisons and lethal gases. Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, conducted experiments on twins, attempting to explore genetic engineering while subjecting them to horrific procedures. The immediate effects were profound physical and psychological suffering, with most victims dying during the experiments or shortly afterwards. Those who survived were left with severe injuries, chronic illnesses, or deep psychological trauma. The long-term effects extended to families and communities as these atrocities became a symbol of human rights violations. The impact on society was immense, and after the war, the Nuremberg trials exposed the horrors of these experiments, leading to the conviction of several German doctors for war crimes and crimes against humanity. These revelations prompted the creation of the Nuremberg Code in 1947, establishing ethical principles for human experimentation, including the requirement of informed consent. While the experiments resulted in some scientific data, their use is heavily debated due to the methods employed. The legacy of these atrocities serve as a reminder of the potential for science to be misused in the absence of ethical standards and respect for human beings. Harlow's monkey experiments, conducted by psychologist Harry Harlow during the 1950s and 1960s, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, are among the most disturbing studies in psychology. These experiments aim to investigate the nature of love, attachment, and maternal bonding, where Harlow separated infant monkeys from their mothers shortly after birth and placed them with two surrogate mothers made of wire. One surrogate provided milk but was cold and metallic, while the other, covered in soft cloth, offered no food but was warm and comforting. The monkeys overwhelmingly preferred the cloth surrogate, clinging to it for comfort, even when the wire surrogate was their only source of nourishment. This demonstrated that emotional attachment and comfort were more critical to healthy development than basic physiological needs like food. In other variations, Harlow exposed the monkeys to extreme psychological stress. He placed them in isolation chambers, known as pits of despair, for weeks or months at a time. The monkeys, subjected to prolonged isolation, exhibited severe behavioral and emotional disturbances, including depression, self-harm, and an inability to interact socially. Many were permanently affected, showing long-term psychological damage. The experiments had profound implications for understanding human attachment and child development. They demonstrated the importance of love and comfort in fostering emotional health, influencing parenting practices, orphanage care, and hospital policies. However, the methods were highly controversial, involving significant animal cruelty, which sparked debates about the ethics of animal research. Harlow's work, while scientifically impactful, remains a reminder of the ethical dilemmas in psychological experimentation. It helped shape ethical guidelines for research and emphasized the need for humane treatment of animals in scientific studies. The Milgram obedience experiment, conducted by psychologist Stanley Milgram at Yale University in 1961, is one of the most infamous studies in social psychology. It aimed to investigate the extent of which ordinary individuals would obey authority figures, even if instructed to perform actions conflicting with their personal conscience. The study was inspired by the Holocaust and sought to understand how seemingly normal people could commit atrocities under orders. Participants were told they were part of a learning experiment and assigned to the role of a teacher, while an actor played the learner. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks of increasing intensity to the learner whenever they answered questions incorrectly. In reality, no shocks were given, but the learner pretended to feel pain, crying out, pleading, and eventually falling silent. Despite the learner's apparent suffering, 65% of participants continued administering shocks up to the maximum level of 450 volts under the idea of being an authoritative experimenter. Some of the people playing the role of the teacher expressed regret or guilt after learning the true nature of the experiments. This study sparked debates about the ethical treatment of research subjects and the responsibility of individuals to resist immoral orders. The experiment profoundly impacted society, demonstrating the power of authority and situational factors in shaping behavior. The Tuskegee Syphilis study, conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the U.S. Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute, is one of the most egregious examples of unethical medical research in American history. The study aimed to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men under the guise of offering free medical care. The study involved 600 black men from Macon County, Alabama, 399 of whom had syphilis, while 201 did not. The participants were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term for various ailments, but they were never informed they had syphilis. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for the disease in 1947, the researchers withheld it from the men to continue their observations. Many suffered severe health complications, went blind, experienced mental deterioration, or died from the disease. Additionally, some passed syphilis to their partners and children. The short-term effects included mistrust and harm to the participants and their families, while believing they were receiving genuine medical care. The long-term effects were far-reaching, deeply eroding the trust in the medical establishment among African Americans. The study is widely regarded as a significant factor contributing to racial disparities in healthcare trust and outcomes. Public outrage erupted when the study was exposed by journalist Jean Heller in 1972. It was immediately terminated, and a $10 million settlement was awarded to survivors and their families. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the U.S. government. The Tuskegee Syphilis study had a profound societal impact, leading to stricter regulations for medical research, including the requirement of informed consent and the establishment of institutional review boards. The experiment remains a reminder of the consequences of racial bias and unethical practices in scientific research. The Stanford Prison experiment, conducted in August 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University, is one of the most infamous studies in social psychology. It aimed to explore how individuals conform to roles of authority and subordination in a simulated prison experiment. The experiment involved 24 male college students who were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a mock prison setup in the basement of the psychology building. The guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and batons, while prisoners were stripped of personal identity, wearing smocks and assigned numbers. Within days, the guards began exhibiting abusive behavior, including psychological manipulation, humiliation, and physical intimidation. Prisoners displayed signs of severe emotional distress, such as anxiety, depression, and even breakdowns. Despite initial plans for the study to last 2 weeks, it was terminated after only 6 days due to the alarming behavior and harm observed. This experiment demonstrated the ease with which ordinary individuals could adopt cruel behaviors in positions of authority, and how power dynamics can lead to dehumanization. Many participants experienced emotional trauma, though some guards later expressed guilt for their actions. Long-term, the study became a cornerstone in discussions about the psychological effects of power and systematic abuse, influencing fields like criminal justice, organizational behavior, and ethics. However, it also faced significant criticism for its ethical breaches, including Zimbardo's dual role as both lead researcher and prison superintendent, which arguably influenced the study's direction. The Stanford Prison experiment profoundly impacted society by highlighting the dangers of unchecked authority and institutionalized abuse. Despite its controversies, it remains a powerful study of human behavior. Project 4.1 was a controversial medical study conducted by the United States government beginning in 1954 to assess the effects of radiation exposure on the residents of the Marshall Islands. It was initiated after the United States conducted the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test on March 1, 1954, at Bikini Atoll, the most powerful nuclear test in U.S. history. The blast unexpectedly produced a much larger yield than anticipated, and radioactive fallout spread over surrounding areas, exposing hundreds of Marshallese people and American servicemen to significant levels of radiation. The residents of the affected atolls were not evacuated until days after the test, during which time they were exposed to radioactive ash. Many suffered acute radiation sickness, including nausea, skin burns, and hair loss. In the short term, the study focused on documenting the immediate health effects, but long-term monitoring revealed devastating consequences, such as increased rates of cancer, thyroid disorders, birth defects, and other chronic illnesses among the exposed population. Project 4.1 has been criticized for its lack of informed consent in the exploitation of the Marshallese people as unsuspecting subjects. Many islanders were not told the true purpose of the research and were inadequately compensated for their suffering. Critics argue that the study prioritized gathering scientific data over protecting the health and well-being of the affected communities. The societal impact of Project 4.1 was profound, fueling debates about the ethics of human experimentation and the environmental and human cost of nuclear testing. It also highlighted the systematic exploitation of marginalized populations. The legacy of the study continues to affect the Marshallese people, who have called for justice, reparations, and further accountability for the harm caused by the U.S. nuclear testing program. Lobotomies, primarily conducted in the mid-20th century, represent one of the most controversial chapters in medical history. The procedure, known as prefrontal lobotomy, involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe to treat severe mental illness. It was pioneered by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Yggesmanis in the 1930s, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1949. In the United States, Dr. Walter Friedman popularized the procedure, performing thousands of lobotomies and developing the transorbital or ice pack lobotomy, which could be performed quickly and without traditional surgery. Initially, lobotomies were seen as a groundbreaking treatment for conditions like schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety, especially in the absence of effective psychiatric medications. However, the procedure often caused devastating consequences. Short-term effects included confusion, disorientation, and personality changes. Long-term effects were far more severe, including cognitive impairments, emotional blunting, loss of motivation, and in many cases, permanent disability. Some patients were left in a vegetative state or died as a result of the procedure. Lobotomies were performed on tens of thousands of individuals worldwide, often without their consent, and vulnerable populations, such as women, minorities, and children, were disproportionately targeted. One of the most infamous cases was that of Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy, who was left permanently incapacitated after a lobotomy. The societal impact of lobotomies were significant, shaping public perceptions of mental health and raising critical questions about medical ethics. By the 1950s, psychiatric medications rendered the procedure largely obsolete. Today, lobotomies are regarded as a dark period in the history of psychiatry, highlighting the dangers of unchecked medical experimentation and the need for ethical standards in patient care. The Guatemala Syphilis experiments, conducted between 1946 and 1948, were unethical medical studies sponsored by the United States Public Health Service and led by Dr. John Charles Cutler. The experiments aimed to study the effectiveness of penicillin in treating STIs, particularly syphilis. They targeted vulnerable populations in Guatemala, including prisoners, mental health patients, soldiers, and sex workers, many of whom were deliberately infected with syphilis and other diseases without their consent. Researchers intentionally exposed subjects to syphilis through the contact with infected individuals or by directly applying the bacteria to their skin or bloodstream. While some participants received penicillin as a treatment, many were left untreated to study the progression of the disease. The experiments resulted in severe physical suffering, long-term health complications, and deaths among the participants. The lack of informed consent and the exploitation of marginalized groups drew parallels to the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Experiments were hidden from public knowledge for decades until they were uncovered by historian Susan Reverby in 2010. This revelation caused outrage, and President Barack Obama, as well as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, issued formal apologies to the Guatemalan government and its people, acknowledging the ethical breaches and the harm inflicted. The short-term effects included physical and psychological suffering for the participants, while the long-term effects extended to families and communities grappling with the aftermath of the experiments. Thalidomide testing, which occurred primarily in the late 1950s and early 1960s, is one of the most disturbing pharmaceutical tragedies in history. Originally developed by a German company in the mid-1950s, thalidomide was marketed as a safe sedative and treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women. The drug was widely distributed in over 40 countries without rigorous safety testing. Shortly after its release, an alarming increase in severe birth defects was observed in children born to mothers who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy. These defects included missing or malformed limbs, organ abnormalities, and other physical deformities. An estimated 10,000 children worldwide were affected, with many dying shortly after birth. Additionally, some adults who took thalidomide experienced peripheral nerve damage and other side effects. The tragedy led to long-term consequences for affected families who struggled with the medical, financial, and emotional challenges of caring for children with disabilities. It also highlighted the inadequacies in drug testing and regulation at the time. In the United States, the drug was never widely distributed, thanks to the efforts of Dr. Francis Kelsey, a reviewer at the FDA, who refused its approval due to insufficient safety data. Her actions likely prevented thousands of additional cases. The thalidomide disaster brought in reforms in drug regulation worldwide, including stricter requirements, clinical trials, and post-market surveillance. It also emphasized the importance of informed consent in medical treatments. Although thalidomide was later repurposed to treat conditions like leprosy, its legacy is overshadowed by the suffering it caused, which continues to influence pharmaceutical ethics and regulation today. The human radiation experiments conducted by the United States government from the 1940s to the 1970s included exposing unsuspecting individuals to radioactive materials to study the effects of radiation on the human body. These experiments were part of Cold War research efforts to understand radiation exposure and its medical applications, as well as to prepare for potential nuclear warfare. Participants included hospital patients, pregnant women, prisoners, military personnel, and vulnerable groups like children and the mentally ill. Most were not informed they were part of such studies. Some were injected with plutonium, uranium, or other radioactive isotopes, while others were exposed to radiation through deliberate environmental contamination or medical procedures. For example, in the Vanderbilt University study during the 1940s, pregnant women were given radioactive iron, unknowingly endangering both themselves and their unborn children. The short-term effects included radiation sickness, burns, and tissue damage, whereas the long-term effects were even more severe, with many participants developing cancer, organ failure, genetic mutations, and other chronic illnesses. Some victims died as a direct result of the experiments, and the lack of consent and the harm caused fueled outrage once the experiments were revealed. The societal impact was significant, particularly after the experiments were exposed in the mid-1990s, leading to public outcry and government investigations. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which published a detailed report in 1995 documenting these abuses. Compensation was provided to some victims, but many cases remain unresolved. The Aversion Project, conducted in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, was a government-backed operation targeting LGBTQ individuals within the South African Defense Force. It aimed to quote-unquote cure homosexuality through chemical castration, electroshock therapy, and forced gender reassignment surgeries. This project operated under the apartheid regime, where discrimination and oppression were institutionalized, and homosexuality was criminalized. Under the direction of Dr. Aubrey Levin, military psychiatrists and medical personnel subjected soldiers suspected of being gay or lesbian to inhumane treatments. Those identified as homosexual were subjected to aversion therapy, which involved pairing same-sex erotic imagery with electroshocks or nausea-inducing drugs in an attempt to suppress their sexual orientation. In severe cases, individuals were coerced into undergoing irreversible surgical procedures, including gender reassignment surgeries, often without informed consent. Many victims were left with permanent physical scars, emotional distress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, and an altered sense of identity. The forced surgeries often left individuals sterile and further marginalized them within society. This horrible operation highlighted the extreme lengths to which oppressive regimes would go to enforce heteronormativity and suppress marginalized groups. The project's exposure in the 1990s, after apartheid ended, sparked outrage and brought attention to the systematic human rights abuses of the era. The Aversion Project remains a haunting example of medical and psychological abuse justified by prejudice and political ideology. Efforts to seek justice and acknowledgement for the victims continue as part of broader movements for LGBTQ rights and historical accountability. The learned helplessness experiments conducted in the 1960s by psychologist Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer explored the psychological phenomenon of learned helplessness, where individuals developed a sense of powerlessness after repeated exposure to uncontrollable negative events. These experiments were primarily conducted on dogs and aimed to understand the relationship between behavior, control, and psychological responses. In the initial experiments, dogs were placed in a harness and exposed to electric shocks that they could not escape. Over time, even when provided an opportunity to avoid the shocks by jumping over a barrier, many of the dogs did not attempt to escape. They had learned that their actions were futile and passively accepted the discomfort. Follow-up studies demonstrated similar patterns in humans, where individuals exposed to uncontrollable negative situations often fail to act when later given a chance to improve their circumstances. The short-term effects of the experiments on the animals included stress, fear, and physical discomfort. The long-term effects were more significant as the experiments demonstrated how repeated exposure to inescapable adversity could result in passivity, depression, and an inability to recognize or respond to opportunities for change. The societal impact of the learned helplessness experiments was profound, shaping our understanding of psychological conditions like depression, anxiety, and trauma. It also contributed to the development of cognitive behavioral therapy, which aims to help individuals reframe negative beliefs and regain a sense of control over their lives. However, the experiments have been criticized for their ethical implications, as they inflicted significant distress on the animals. Despite these criticisms, the concept of learned helplessness remains a cornerstone in psychological science, influencing both research and therapeutic practices. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the experiments I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 2 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.